She always woke up before the sun, as if her body knew that the first light of the day was just another reminder of the silence that awaited her. There was no alarm, no rush, no voices. Only the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway and the creaking of old wood beneath her feet. To an outsider, it was a sacred routine. But to her, some mornings weighed like an invisible sacrifice. The cold water from the wash basin marked the start of yet another day in which she would not allow herself to complain. Not for lack of desire, but because silence there was more than a rule, it was a vow. The fogged mirror didn't show vanity, but it also didn't show who she was before all of this. And that, sometimes, hurt more than the absence of words. The sound of the bells filled the air with something that mixed discipline and memory. It was beautiful, reverent, but inside her, it echoed differently. Because that sound wasn't just a call to prayer. It was the constant reminder that the world outside kept going, even without her. Everyone thinks a nun's life is full of peace. And maybe it is, but it's a peace that often comes after wars fought in silence. No one sees the battles that aren't shouted, or the decisions made with a heavy heart and eyes fixed on the ground. The clothes she wore weren't just a habit. They were armor, and at the same time, a prison. They protected her from the world's malicious stares, but also hid old desires, forgotten wants, questions that could never be asked. Breakfast was taken in silence, side by side with other women, who seemed to float in perfect discipline. But even there, she knew, some were there for faith, others to escape. And all of them, without exception, carried a story the world would never know. The prayer room was always lit with natural light. The sheer curtain let the sun in as if God had a spotlight just for that place. It was beautiful to see. But sometimes she wished that light would say something. A sign, a word, a yes. And I'm here. In the corner of the altar, a candle flickered. She always wondered why that detail caught her attention so much. Maybe because it was the only thing in that routine that seemed alive, unstable, flawed, real. People think nuns are women without desire, without conflict, without a past. But maybe that's the biggest lie ever told by the image of faith. Because the truth is that each one carries not only the cross she chose, but also the one she had no choice but to bear. During other people's confessions, she heard sins she'd never dare to imagine. And still, she listened with compassion. Even when, inside, her own guilt tightened her chest like invisible fists. Some days, she caught herself staring at the chapel windows as if she could see life passing by outside. Not that she wanted to be in it, but there was something uncomfortable about the idea that time moved forward, and she remained unchanged. She heard the laughter of children from the school next door and remembered when, still young, she believed becoming a nun would be a liberation, not from life, but from the pain it brought. But now she began to wonder if she had only traded one kind of pain for another. There are lives that seem so distant from our own that we don't even think to question them. A nun's life is one of them. But maybe what's scary is precisely the fact that there's more humanity in that choice than we dare admit. There were days when faith felt like a dress too large, and she had to hold onto it tightly so it wouldn't slip through her soul's fingers. In her prayers, sometimes she didn't say anything. She just stayed there, kneeling, feeling the weight of her own silence. Because some pleas don't become words, only invisible tears, dried before they even fall. No one knew how many nights she woke in the middle of the night, unsure if it was a spiritual calling or just another dream interrupted by doubts that never sleep. If you've ever felt alone, even surrounded by people who understand, you might grasp the kind of solitude she lived with every day. With faith, but without celebration. With devotion, but without rest. Time inside the convent didn't follow the world's clock. The hours didn't rush, they repeated. Always the same, always sacred. And for some, that was stability. For her, sometimes it was prison. She knew the name of every plant in the garden, because it was there that she found a bit of what couldn't be said in words. Each leaf, a confession. Each flower, a request. Each root, a secret. Some live in silence because they believe speaking is a waste. She lived in silence because she knew that if she spoke too much, she would reveal truths that could shake the faith of others. At Mass, her eyes scanned the faces in attendance, and often she saw pain there heavier than her own. It was in those moments she remembered why she had chosen that life. Even without answers, she still wanted to serve. The hard part wasn't saying yes to the calling. The hard part was continuing to say yes every day afterward. She didn't regret it, but she didn't romanticize it either. She knew the life she led wasn't made of constant miracles, but of daily persistence. And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all. In every corner of the house, there were memories of what she had left behind. Sometimes she wondered if she could have lived outside that place. But those reflections never lasted long. Duty always called first. The most ironic thing was that even while living for faith, she questioned more than anyone she knew. Because faith, to her, wasn't certainty. It was a decision. If you think you know someone's life just by appearances, maybe it's time to look again, and deeper. Because behind the veil, there was a whole woman, made of flesh, soul, and silence. There was a day when she wanted to leave. Not to escape, but to breathe. She walked to the garden gate and stood there. Just looking, just feeling. She didn't need to go. She just needed to remember she could still want to. Have you ever lived something no one believes just because it looks too calm on the outside? Visitors to the convent found the first step in the hallway was always the same, as if the floor had already learned to recognize her. She walked lightly, but not out of tranquility. It was out of habit. In that applause-free routine, each gesture was almost a silent prayer, repeated so many times it had become part of her body. Others saw dedication, but they didn't know that, inside, that lightness was a constant effort not to collapse. When she sat at the table with the others, she smiled with her eyes. She avoided being the first to speak, even though it wasn't forbidden. It was as if there were an unwritten rule that the more inward she became, the closer she'd be to something sacred. But deep down, she knew silence wasn't always holiness. Sometimes it was just fear of slipping up with words. One of the younger ones always watched her with admiration, like someone seeing in an older woman a mirror of the future. She noticed it with affection, but also with pain, because she knew the admiration came from the outside and didn't reach the cracked pieces hidden beneath the habit. It's easy to admire someone who seems strong. Harder is dealing with someone who's already broken and glued everything back together on the inside. One day, during group prayer, one of the sisters began to cry silently. The others kept their eyes closed, their faces serene, as if they hadn't noticed. But she saw, she felt it, and wanted to stand up and embrace her. But she didn't, because their even comfort had to follow protocol. And that hurt more than any physical pain. She had already learned that in that life, not all pain had permission to be shared. Some had to be carried alone, like invisible crosses. That's how it worked. No one said it directly, but it was enough to watch the looks when someone spoke too much, or when a voice trembled during a reading. Working with the children was what kept her most alive. There was something in those little eyes that broke down. Her defenses, the sincere questions, the spontaneous hugs, the drawings handed over with paint-stained hands. There, she remembered that joy still existed, even if only for a few minutes. Sometimes, that was enough to keep going. During Mass, she observed the faithful with an attention that bordered on contemplation. Each face told a story she would never know, but that she imagined. And in those imaginings, she often found parts of herself. It was as if everyone, in some way, was trying to hold on to something that was about to fall. One day, an old lady stopped her in the hallway and said, "I wish I had your peace." She smiled, thanked her, but spent the rest of the day thinking about that phrase, because, inside, she was at war. Not with others, but with everything she had left behind, with everything she still didn't understand, with everything she never dared to say. She used to keep little notes. Small messages she wrote to herself on folded pieces of paper, hidden inside the Bible, scattered phrases, unanswered questions, memories she didn't want to forget, but couldn't carry out in the open. It was her way of keeping alive a side of her no one else saw. One of those notes read, "If faith were the absence of pain, it wouldn't need to be a choice." She had written that on a night when she questioned whether she was there out of conviction or fear of returning to the world. To this day, she wasn't sure of the answer. On special dates, when the community sent flowers and gifts, she thanked them with tenderness. But often, she felt like a character on a decorated stage, as if the expected devotion had to be rehearsed along with the smile. And that left her exhausted. Once, she found a child crying alone in the courtyard. She sat beside her without saying a word. Just stayed there, breathing together. And in that shared silence, she felt something rare, true presence. There, no. One had to pretend to be strong. And maybe that was the closest to God she had felt in weeks. On rainy days, she liked to look out the window for long minutes. The water streaming down the glass seemed to echo what she was trying to hold inside. There was something therapeutic in the repetition of the drops, as if each one carried a little of what she couldn't say out loud. She avoided talking about the past. Not out of shame, but because she knew that, in this new life, the past only served to test the firmness of the present. Still, sometimes, a song, a scent, or a date on the calendar was enough to open windows inside her that she spent the whole year trying to keep shut. The simple clothes were a relief. She no longer had to worry about appearances, combinations, or impressions. But they were also an erasure, as if each layer hid more than it protected. As if her story was being covered, day by day, by a sacred cloth that didn't allow memories to speak aloud. At one meal, she heard someone say that life there was a paradise of order. She swallowed the food with difficulty. She didn't disagree. But she also knew that even paradises have walls. And not all walls protect, some isolate. Have you ever felt like part of something, and still alone? In the manual tasks, she found a different kind of peace. Sewing, cleaning, organizing books. It wasn't about what she was doing, but the fact that she could do it without thinking. The movement of her hands was a kind of prayer. The body made when the soul was too tired for words. Every now and then, someone new arrived at the convent. And they always asked the same things. What was it like? Was it hard? Did she regret it? She answered calmly. But deep down, what she most wanted to say was, "Come and live it. Then you'll understand." The faith she carried wasn't made of steel. It was like fine ceramic, beautiful, useful, but breakable. And maybe that's what made it real. Faith that survives doubt isn't the strongest. It's the most honest. At a retreat, she heard a sermon about renunciation. The preacher spoke with strength, with conviction. And while everyone seemed moved, she thought, has he ever renounced something that truly hurt? The answer got stuck in her throat. There was a shelf in the library no one touched. She used to go there not for the books, but for the silence that corner offered. That was where she wrote new notes, where she looked inward without fear of being seen from the outside. One afternoon, she found an old letter. It was during the night that things took shape. While the convent plunged into absolute silence, her mind awakened with the intensity of someone who had held everything in throughout the day. There, in the dark, thoughts moved like footsteps. In an empty hallway, echoing memories that seemed to whisper that nothing there was as unchangeable as it appeared. She always believed that the silence of the night was a kind of truth that the day concealed. During communal prayers, everything sounded in harmony. But at night, harmony gave way to inner confusion, not rebellion, but awareness of all she had chosen, of all she had lost, and of all she still insisted on feeling, even after all the vows. One early morning, she awoke for no apparent reason. The room was calm, and yet her chest felt tight. She got up, covered by the coldness of the tiles, and walked to the small window. The city slept outside. And there, in that contrast, she understood. Within that closed world, there were hearts still dreaming of everything they had let pass by. Sometimes she tried to remember the last time she had been called by her first name, not the name she used in the convent, but the one she received as a child. And realizing that she couldn't clearly remember the last time she heard, it was more painful than she expected. As if, at some point in the journey, she had stopped being whole. During spiritual readings, she felt divided. The words were beautiful, inspiring, but inside, there was a voice that always asked, "And what if these words aren't enough?" She never dared to say it out loud. But it was a question that returned often. In the eyes of the community, she was a symbol of discipline, faith, and strength. And perhaps in some way, she was. But that image came at a cost. A burden that prevented her from faltering. Because to be seen as a pillar means staying upright, even when everything inside feels like collapsing. At a silent retreat, where no one spoke for 3 entire days, she discovered something unexpected, that her own silence was louder than any conversation. Because there, without distractions, everything emerged. Old longings, suppressed desires, questions she had buried beneath chants and routines. She never stopped believing. But she began to realize that faith isn't a permanent state. It's a daily exercise of relearning to trust, even when answers don't come. And that, perhaps, was more human than anything she had ever read in the holy books. During a cleaning task in the chapel, she found an old photograph fallen between the pews. It was of a group of much older nuns from another time. Their faces smiled, but their eyes carried the same weariness she saw in herself. She kept the image, not out of attachment, but because she felt there were mirrors hidden in time. One day, a young aspirant asked her what was the hardest part of that life. She hesitated, thought about saying giving up the world or letting go of family. But the answer that nearly slipped out was being forgotten. She swallowed the words, smiled, and replied with something beautiful. But the truth stayed stuck between her teeth. Have you ever felt that, even while being necessary, the world around you began to see you as part of the furniture? The days seemed to repeat with slight variations in weather. Sun, rain, wind, fog. But within the routine, everything was too stable. And that stability, though comforting, sometimes felt suffocating. Because the human soul also needs surprises, disruptions, something to awaken the unexpected. There was a wooden box kept in the dormitory wardrobe. Inside, small objects, a child's bracelet, a piece of cloth, a half-burned photograph. None of them had real value, but all carried pieces of the story no one there knew. It was the silent reliquary of the woman who still lived behind the habit. During collective reading moments, when each sister read a sacred passage, she wondered if everyone truly believed in those words, or if, like her, they simply leaned on them so they wouldn't fall apart. It wasn't disbelief. It was a longing for truth. And truth, at times, was too uncomfortable to be spoken. A note left on the bed said only, "We are praying for you." It was sincere. But she couldn't help but think that maybe it would be more comforting to hear, "We're here." Even if your faith fails, because prayer is beautiful. But presence is what sustains. In one of the lesser used hallways there was an old painting of a saint holding a carnation. She always looked at that image with attention. Not for the religious figure, but for the flower. because it was there, in that tiny detail, that she saw something beyond perfection. A touch of humanity. She loved teaching music to the children. And every time she played the keyboard, she felt less like a nun and more like a human being. Because music, unlike rules, allowed mistakes. And in that space where each note could be free, she found parts of herself she had forgotten even existed. One night, she dreamed she was walking down an ordinary street, dressed like any other woman. No veil, no cross, no lowered gaze. She woke with a heavy heart. Not out of regret, but from longing for what she had never lived. On an ordinary day, while watering the patio plants, she thought that true faith was more like gardening than theology. It requires patience, silence, care, repetition. And sometimes, even doing everything right, the flowers don't bloom. But you keep tending anyway. Someone once said she always seemed at peace. And that stayed with her. Because she understood that, for many, seeming at peace is enough. But true peace, she knew, didn't live on the face. It lived in silent choices, in decisions no one applauds, in battles no one knows you're fighting at. The back of the wardrobe, she found an old rosary. The beads were worn, the threads loose. But there was a quiet strength there that didn't come from the object, but from the hands that had used it before her. It was like holding time. And that brought comfort. She avoided large mirrors. Not out of vanity, but because she had grown used to not seeing herself fully. And when, by chance, she saw her whole reflection, it was like meeting a stranger dressed in her skin. Once, she received an anonymous letter with a question. "Are you happy in there?" She spent days wondering whether to respond. And even though she never wrote back, the question lingered like time had left subtle marks on her gestures. She walked more slowly, not out of weakness, but out of care. As if each step carried more than just the weight of her body. It carried the burden of choices that could not be undone. And it was precisely that awareness that made her appear so steady in others' eyes. No one saw that steadiness was often a form of defense. During a meeting among the sisters, she heard stories of inspiring vocations, miraculous conversions, supernatural callings. When it was her turn, she hesitated. Her story had no lights or voices from above. It had silence, an existential emptiness, and a deep desire to find meaning where the world only offered noise. That didn't seem sacred enough. So she just smiled and said what was necessary. She kept letters she never wrote. Answers to questions never asked. Confessions that never left her soul. Some were written on folded pages. Others existed only in her mind, revisited like silent prayers. That's how she kept alive a part of herself that didn't fit within the convent, but couldn't exist outside it either. A younger sister, newly arrived, asked her what she missed most from life. Before. She thought for a moment, and answered, being called by my name without it being followed by a function. That lingered in the air. It wasn't a complaint. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest sacrifice isn't what you leave behind, but what you stop being. In one of the reading rooms, she found a book with scribbled pages. Not from carelessness, but from necessity. Someone before her had written notes in the margins. Outbursts, reflections, small rebellions. She flipped through it carefully. And there, she found an invisible companion. Someone who had also screamed. Inside without moving their lips. She always believed that the most courageous act of religious life was to stay. Not because fleeing wasn't tempting, but because staying required constant renewal. And renewing oneself in there, every day, was a form of resistance no one applauded. While organizing supplies in the storage room, she found a jar with an expired date. It seemed trivial, but made her think about everything inside her that had also expired over time. Dreams, desires, restlessness. They were still there, stored, intact, but past the shelf life allowed. She never told anyone, but there was a painting hidden behind the door of her room. A simple painting of an open field under a reddish sky. Every time she looked at it, she felt a freedom she didn't know in practice. It was her silent way of remembering that horizons still existed, even while living behind walls. Have you ever kept something just to feel like you still have a choice? In the library, among books by saints and theologians, she found a small old diary. No name, no cover, just words. She read slowly. Every sentence seemed written with tears. In one of them, someone wrote, "Faith taught me to be silent when." I wanted to scream, and that hit deep. Because it wasn't just true. It was still true. While preparing for a ceremony, she was tasked with arranging the pews again. It was the third time that month. She didn't complain. But that day, she decided to move one of them a few centimeters beyond the usual mark. No one noticed. But she did. And that was enough to feel that, even within a rigid system, there was still room for harmless small transgressions. In confession, she heard someone say, "I feel like God has abandoned me." She kept her composure, offered kind words, and prayed. But she spent the rest of the night with that in her chest. Because, though she never admitted it, she had felt the same way before. And she didn't know if the pain came from remembering, or from not having the courage to say it. Music was an escape valve. Whenever she could, she sat at the keyboard and played simple melodies. Sometimes she improvised. Sometimes she repeated the same sequence until her mind emptied. There, she felt something that even liturgy couldn't offer, an emotional freedom that required no explanations, no dogmas. She dreamed of water. Often, she dreamed of rivers, of rain, of silent dives. She found it strange, but she understood. Maybe it was her unconscious saying she needed to flow, to move, to let something carry her. But in real life, everything was containment. One day, she forgot to lock her room door. When she returned, someone had entered and left a note with just 2 words, "I'm here." She never found out who it was. But that simple gesture held more power than dozens of sermons. Sometimes, all we need is to know we're not invisible. Sunday visits always brought smiles, songs, and sweet words. But what moved her most was when small children looked at her with curious eyes, unsure whether she was someone real or just part of the church. That hurt, because it showed how much the habit could erase one's humanity. During a painting activity with the children, she drew a house. The other sisters praised her drawing. But what no one noticed was that the house had an open window. There always was. In every drawing she made. As if, even unintentionally, she was asking to breathe. Do you also carry within you a half-open window? During a moment of cleaning the chapel, she tripped slightly and nearly fell. Alone, she caught herself on a pew and laughed. She truly laughed. Laughed at the scare, the exhaustion, the weight of trying to be perfect all the time. And in that laughter, she realized that much of her was still alive, even when vocation tried to turn her into a statue. One day, looking at the empty altar, before Mass, she asked herself, "Does God ever feel lonely too?" The question struck her deeply, because she realized that maybe everything we do for faith is also an attempt not to feel too alone. Time inside the convent wasn't measured like in regular calendars. It was felt in the repetition of gestures, the order of tasks, the sound of bells marking the passing of hours with a precision that made watches unnecessary. But even though everything was predictable, what happened on the inside followed no schedule. Internal changes had no set time to begin or to end. She began noticing details she had previously ignored. The soft creak of the chapel door, the smell of damp wood, the sound candles made as they slowly burned. Everything seemed to want to speak, as if the world around her knew that, in silence, she listened better. And in those unspoken listenings, she felt more alive than during many speeches. In recent months, she began waking up before the bell rang. Not out of obligation, but because her body already knew what was coming. And in those moments of anticipation, lying in the dark, she thought about everything she had lived inside those walls, everything she had been denied, everything she had learned. And she asked herself, did all this make me holier, or just stronger? She learned that not every surrender is visible, that some sacrifices aren't praised, but heard as if they were, that there are internal victories no one celebrates, yet they hold everything together, and that there are prayers that, even without words, make heaven tremble. One summer afternoon she was asked to tend to the garden. The plants were dry, some nearly dead. She began watering them gently, one by one. And in that repetitive motion, she realized something both obvious and profound. Some things only bloom if cared for daily. Her life was like that too. She no longer expected to be understood, nor did she crave applause. What she wanted most was to be remembered as someone who tried to be faithful, not to the system, but to her own soul. Because even in a place designed to stifle desire, she chose to preserve what was still left of herself. Have you ever tried to protect a part of yourself even when everything around you asked you to disappear? There was a day when they were all gathered in prayer, and at the end, someone said, "May we be whole, even in silence." That stayed with her, because being whole in there was the greatest challenge, and perhaps the greatest miracle. She began carrying a small piece of paper on which she had written, "Don't forget who you were." She didn't show it to anyone, didn't read it aloud. She simply kept it in her pocket, as a quiet reminder that behind every vocation, there was a woman trying to stay alive inside. During a storm, the convent lost power. They all gathered in the dining hall by candlelight. And there, in the shared darkness, they spoke like they hadn't in a long time. No ceremony, no masks, no titles, just voices. And she understood that sometimes the absence of light reveals more than its presence. She knew not everyone there would remain. Some sisters would leave, others would walk away from it all. But that didn't bother her, because she understood that vocation is not a prison, it's a journey. And every journey has detours, returns, and restarts. Deep in her heart, there were still questions that had never been answered. But there was something greater, the acceptance that maybe they never would be. And that, in a way, was liberating. Because learning to live with questions is one of the most mature forms of faith. Have you come to understand that some answers don't come because the search itself is the answer? On a quiet Sunday, while walking through the courtyard, she saw a leaf fall from a tall tree. She watched its entire descent, from the top to the ground. And in that instant, she thought maybe that's what she had been seeking all along. The lightness to fall without fear. Knowing she had already served her time on the branch, she learned to say goodbye to old versions of herself. To let parts die so others could be born. To not cling to the idealized image others had of her. Because no image can sustain a heart in conflict. While organizing a religious event, she was praised for her ability to lead without imposing. She smiled simply. But inside, she knew it came from a deeper place. The exhaustion of having tried to be someone else and failing. Now she preferred simply to be. She began writing phrases on loose papers and hiding them in books throughout the library. Small seeds for whoever found them. Don't be afraid to feel. Even silence can be heard. Not everything you left behind has forgotten you. It was her way of leaving footprints without needing to appear. Time hadn't erased her scars, but it taught her to touch them with respect. Because every pain she lived in there became part of who she was. And as much as she wished she had lived other things, she understood that some pains were also teachers. Once, she saw one of the sisters crying alone. She didn't approach. She didn't offer words, she just sat nearby, in silence. And in that simple act, she understood. Sometimes, presence is what's left when there's nothing else to give. If this story is touching you, maybe it's because you too carry wounds that can't be spoken, but that still need to be acknowledged. Stay a while longer. Let yourself feel. She learned that holiness has no shape, no scent of incense, no religious title. Holiness to her was being able to get up every day even when nothing made sense. It was continuing to care for others even when no one cared for her. At the end of the day, she sat alone near the plants. She watched the sun leave slowly. Those minutes between light and dark were her favorite, because they reflected her soul well, a place between two worlds, not fully belonging to either. She never wanted to be a symbol of anything, but she knew that, to some people, she already was, and that scared her. Because being a symbol demands constant strength, and deep down, she only wanted to be someone who tried to love and serve with honesty, even while full of doubts. While crafting a new habit, she observed the fabrics, the threads,